just want to introduce our leader of this reading, Elaine Pascale, aka the godmother of horror, is the author of The Bloodlights. If nothing else, Eve, We've Enjoyed the Fruit, The Kitchen Witches, The Language of Crows, and The Solstice. She has had stories published in over 24 magazines and anthologies. She is the editor of Darkness Most Foul and the co-editor of Dancing in the Shadows, a tribute to Anne Rice. She is a regular contributor to Pen of the Damned and the Ladies of Horror Picture Prompt Challenge. She is a co-chair of the Florida chapter of HWA, Horror Writers Association, and also a voiceover actress. Elaine enjoys chocolate, a robust full moon, reading spam emails, and paddleboarding. I love it.
Thank you so much. I do appreciate it. And of course, right now, as I'm reading, the sun is coming in and making a weird pattern on my face, but whatever. The show must go on. So I'm kind of starting close to like the third act of my novella, where we are at this point. Naomi and her husband are trapped in a hurricane. She has been caught in an MLM scheme selling supplements meant to assuage the symptoms of perimenopause from which she suffers. Her husband's been acting really strangely, and people have been disappearing around storms. And yes, I have lived through hurricanes, so the descriptions of the destruction is from memory. Brad, who had taken the pacing 30 minutes prior, announced, "I'm putting the tarp up." Now, Naomi could see only water from their window. "It's too dangerous. The roof isn't even leaking. We need to protect it." "That's not what a tarp's for." He wasn't listening, but was pulling on his galoshes and rain gear, which would do little against the rising floodwater. "The rain stopped, but the water's still rising. Where are you going to put a ladder? Please, we can wait until tomorrow." "I'm not having the stars fall on our heads while we sleep." He turned and smiled, and his smile was so boyish that she remembered falling in love with him for the first time. Since then, the years have been a series of falling in and out of love. She returned his smile. "My dad used to say that when I was little." Brad nodded. "It's an island thing. Besides," he pointed across the street, "she's got hers up already." Naomi couldn't argue that. The neighbor whose grass was always short and even, despite never seeing her mow, whose Christmas decorations rivaled the Macy's window, and whose barbecue always smelled like it was prepared by a Michelin chef, had a tarp securely fastened to the roof of her house. There was no explanation for how she managed to scurry up 12 feet of wet concrete without being noticed. "She beat me again." "I thought we were ignoring the neighbors." "You," he chucked a finger under her chin as he headed to the garage, "you are ignoring the neighbors." Having him touch her after days of seeming to avoid her bolstered Naomi's spirits. "Should I come hold the ladder?" she called, heading toward the garage to see him hoisting a ladder through a window. She frowned. "I think that's the universe telling you to wait." "Can't get that automatic door open. Even if I did, the water would pour on in here and soak your precious boxes." The mention of her inventory shook some of the storm-related shock from her brain. She looked at her containers and silently counted them. "One's missing." He was focused on finding flat earth to stand the ladder upon. "A box. One of the boxes is missing." "Maybe it's still in the car," meaning beneath the tree that smashed into the car. Her heart picked up speed again. She went into the house to try to tally the number of bottles that had been in that box. She had a spreadsheet for inventory, but she didn't want to waste the battery on her laptop. She looked out the back window. It was dark, even though they were still an hour or so before sunset. Against the navy backdrop of the dark water and sky, she saw one of her containers. After confirming that Brad was consumed with his tarp work at the front of the house, Naomi struggled with the back door. The rain had caused it to swell, and it stubbornly clung to the frame. Once she was able to wrench the door open, she stepped onto what had been their lanai. The steel beams had collapsed, and the screens had been blown away. The water was up to her hips, and her trek toward the container was impeded by downed tree limbs and blown out shingles, shutters, and window frames that created submerged stumbling blocks. She did not want to fall into the filthy water, and she tried to push the thought of live down wires out of her mind. She kept one eye on the plastic container that appeared to be caught on a pile of detritus. It was unusual to encounter alligators in the brackish water on the bayside, but it would not have been impossible for a toothy reptile to have been waylaid by the storm. Each step meant placing her foot into the unknown, yet she stubbornly pursued the container. She prayed the majority of the inventory could be salvaged. A dead raccoon floated past her, and she felt herself tearing up, not for the dead mammal she had never met, but for the predicament she now found herself in. She could not retreat to the false comfort of financial support from FEMA and insurance. She had been down both paths before, and they were dead ends. Finances had already put a strain on her marriage. She feared the damage from this storm would be the breaking point. That thought breached the dam that held back her tears. She wanted to scream, but she was still close enough for Brad to hear. There was no need to endanger him by making him believe she needed to be rescued. She looked back, seeing the tarp unfurl down the rear of the house, waiting to be secured to the roof. She saw the image of a bird, just like the one that had been given to her grandmother. She found it remarkable that that brand was still around and wondered when Brad had purchased it, as she was usually in charge of disaster supplies. The box was nearly within reach when Naomi's foot came down on a slippery rock and her ankle twisted, bringing her to her knees. She swallowed water as she gasped in shock and pain. Why, she choked, looking to the sky, which was beginning to show a spectacle of stars. She had forgotten that the universe presented the most glorious starry nights following the most devastating storms. It was like a reward for withstanding the worst that nature could deliver. The stars reminded her that Brad would finish installing his star catcher soon and look for her. She pulled herself up onto her good foot and tentatively placed the injured ankle on the muddy floor of the hurricane-crafted lake in her yard. The pain caused her to grimace, but she bit her lip and propelled forward, gaining on the plastic container that appeared even more devious now that it had caused her both physical and economic harm. She leaned forward and grabbed the box by the handles, realizing that she now had to cover the terrain back to the house. She would be forced to be honest with Brad. There was no way to mask her wet clothing or the smell that was now embedded in her skin and hair. And a shower still days away, maybe even a week or so, she reminded herself, sinking into pity. Once the container was freed from the jetson, it moved easily, floating atop the water. Naomi knew that boxes of cereals within would have provided additional weight. She paused to lift the lid and peer inside. She prayed she would see her inventory intact, but her prayers were ignored. Instead, she saw an old book wrapped in yards of cellophane and a smaller box locked with a padlock. She looked back to the roof to see if Brad was finished. The tarp was gone. Oh, shit, she whispered. That was not a good sign. She had to get back. She pulled the container along with her, planning to examine it later. She bounced along tediously, floating more than walking to avoid putting too much weight on her ankle. It felt as if it took 3 times as long to return to the house as it did to retrieve the container, and she cursed herself for her impulsivity. Brad, she called as she carried the container through the back door. I know I shouldn't go out. I just saw some of my stuff, what I thought was my box. There was no one in the living room. She checked the bedroom and the bathroom. No sign of Brad. She went to the garage and peeked out the window Brad had used as an exit. The ladder was no longer there. She ran for the front door, fearing he had gotten disoriented in the storm, only to find that reality was worse than her fears. Brad lay on their porch, wrapped in the tarp.